It was probably 12 years ago, maybe. This was before I was in my accident. My brother-in-law and I decided that he would run with me. He had been working out at the gym, and he was feeling really like he was in great shape, and so he was excited. He wanted to run with me, and we were all up at Cheryl's other brother's cabin in West Virginia, and he and his fiancee Penny were getting married the next Sunday, and they'd asked me to perform the ceremony. Well, it was a very hilly area, and in this gated community where this cabin was, there was about a 5-mile loop around this community, and it was very, very hilly. Well, I wasn't too worried about it because it was April and I was training for a 50-miler in June to run through the mountains in South Dakota, through the Black Hills. And so I thought I could probably keep up, and we started out. And I was a little competitive. I knew running a little bit. And so I let him set the pace a bit faster than I knew that he'd be able to handle there on those long hills. And I said, look, I'm just going to follow you. Whatever you do, I'll just follow you. Well, we were about halfway through the 5 miles, and he decided that he was going to walk the rest of the way. And I ran on just figuring that he would catch up. And when I finished the first round, I had a little bit of time and I needed the training, so I just ran it again. And when I got back, I looked like I had run 10 miles on, hilly terrain, and he was showered and resting. And he said, "Are you nuts? Have you lost your mind? I'm not running those hills. You're just on your own." And so here I was exercising by myself. And I've wondered since if maybe in that story we don't see a picture of the church. Oh, we're busy. We're excited. We're exercising. We're doing all the right things. Church is busy. But have you ever just stopped and thought, are we just exercising by ourselves? Are we just talking to ourselves? Are we really impacting people who are far from God? And I was waiting for a plane outside of Chattanooga, or actually was at the Chattanooga airport. I had just been to my mother's 85th birthday celebration, and I was heading back to Huron, South Dakota. There was a woman there in the airport, and we got to talking. We talked about that a little bit in Sabbath school. I got to talking a little bit, and I told her I was visiting near Collegedale for my mom's birthday. And she said, "Oh, I used to live in Collegedale." I said, "Oh, really? Well, did you like living there?" She said, "Oh, yeah, it was great. I lived on this big circle, and all the neighbors were Seventh-day something. And I think they were all part of some big church, all of the neighbors." I said, "Really?" "Yeah, oh yeah, nice people, I guess. The only thing that I really knew about them is that they didn't do anything on Saturday." "Isn't that weird? Have you ever heard of that?" "Yeah," I said, "that's pretty weird." "Well, what do you do for a living?" she says. "Well, is that any of your business?" "No," I said, "I'm a pastor." "Oh, what denomination?" And when I think back, the conversation, it still haunts me. And I wonder, how is it that a person lives in a place compromised of almost all Seventh-day Adventists, and she's living there for several years, and the only thing that she knows about Adventists is that we don't do much on Sunday or Saturday. And I'm looking at myself when I say this. I hardly know my neighbors where I live. It just makes me wonder, are we just talking to ourselves? And like you, I love church. I love camp meetings. I love hanging out with Adventists. And I went to all of our schools, all the way through almost. I'm a second-generation Adventist. But I wonder, when we leave church, are we really making an impact in the world? We come together. and we talk about reaching the lost, right? I mean, this is the year that it's going to happen, and I hope that's true, but I wonder. You know, the Apostle Paul resonated with some of these questions, and you can find those comments in 1 Corinthians, if you have your Bible or your device with you. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, we want to look at today. And here he gives some of his heartache and his struggles in this issue that we're talking about here today. In 1 Corinthians 9, beginning in verse 19. Let's begin with verse 19. 1 Corinthians 9, verse 19. Let me know when you get that. All right. Verse 19. For though I am free from all men, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win the more. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. And to those who are without law, as without law, not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ, that I might win those who are without law. Paul here is saying, I do everything that I can. I think outside of the box, so that when I'm with the heathen, those that are far from God, I can relate to them. I can win them to Jesus. That's my mission. That's what I want to do. When I'm with the heathen, I do everything that I know how to reach them with the gospel of Jesus. You know, we even have a hymn where we sing, He was a friend of sinners, right? You know, I can tell you that was not a complimentary title in his day. What it did mean was that Jesus really did hang out with some very unsavory people. Prostitutes, cheats, tax collectors. I mean, he was a friend of sinners, it says. Now, as we talked about last week, we would all agree it's good that we be doers of the word. And I think every one of us would say like Paul, yeah, I want to do everything that I know how to do in order to win people to Jesus. People that don't know about God. You know, I think all of us have a heart to win those who are far from God, but sometimes it just gets messy. It's messy. A friend of mine told me of how him and a classmate in college wanted to be called to the same conference, which when they graduated, which didn't happen. But they both got calls, and one friend went to this multi-staff church, and he would often call on the phone just expressing his frustration. He said, it just feels like we're not doing anything here, but we're just playing church. It just feels like such a sham. We're not making much impact, really, in our community at all. We're just going through the motions. And after a while, he said, it's just unbearable. He said, I just can't stand it any longer. And so with the board's blessing, he started this special seeker service to reach out to those who didn't really know God, who were far from God, and the service just exploded. I mean, this was a big church, but they had over 200 people every Saturday night coming to this seeker service. But it wasn't too long, and some of the church members started complaining. The deacons didn't like having to come in early on Sunday morning and sweep up all the cigarettes in the parking lot. Another parent complained because their child had heard some really foul language in the bathroom from one of these seekers. He said, I mean, he shouldn't have to learn those kinds of cuss words in church of all places, right? And you can hardly blame the parent for feeling that way. Like I said, this gets really messy when we start saying we're going to be all about reaching out, reaching for lost people. I mean, it can get really, really messy. You know, the whole thing blew up. At a board meeting, they were arguing back and forth. Some of the board members were wanted to shut the whole thing down. And at one point, a long-term member stood up and she put her finger in this young pastor's face and she said, maybe you don't understand it, young man. But this church was founded only for the culturally elite. The young pastor said, I had no idea that was the mission of this church. And he said, I want nothing to do with that. I'm not going to give my one and only life to a cause that like exclusively reaching out and catering to the culturally elite. He left the church. He left pastoring. A few weeks later, this same woman was in the lobby of the church, and this was after they had shut down the seeker service. And their attendance just plummeted, and she was gloating to a friend there in the lobby out loud so that everybody could hear. Isn't it wonderful, she said, we finally got our church back. Isn't it wonderful? It's just us now. We can just talk to ourselves, right? And the church is just as far removed from the heathen as they ever were. And the truth is, many people there are happy about this. Jesus, though, it says he was a friend of sinners. And it got really messy. It got messy for Jesus. And Paul says, that's what I want to be. I want to reach out to the heathen, do everything that I know how to reach people that are far from the kingdom. Reading on in verse 22. 1 Corinthians 9, verse 22. To the weak I became as weak that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all men that I might by all means save some. So here in verse 22, it says, I have become all things to all men so that I can by all possible means. 3 emphatic statements of all, and you would expect him to say, so that I might save all, right? But he doesn't say that. He says, so that I might save some. Because it's hard work. I mean, I understand while after a while many churches just settle in with the unwritten mission statement. Let's just amuse ourselves. Let's just talk to ourselves. I remember when this passage first took hold of my heart. And I couldn't even sleep at night about it, and I kept tossing and turning because I didn't have any significant friends outside of the church. I mean, my whole life revolved around the Seventh-day Adventist church. And it occurred to me, I eat with Adventists. I spent a lot of my Saturday evenings with Adventists. I worshiped with Adventists. Everything I did, it was around this small community of faith. And I loved the community. It wasn't that. But God kept pressing me. You got to be more intentional. You got to reach out and build friendships with people who are far from God. You've got to be intentional about reaching the lost. And so I started to make it a matter of prayer. How to reach people like this? I mean, how do we reach the lost? How do we do that? And I wish I could tell you that I started a huge mission and me and Mother Teresa, we won thousands of people, to Jesus. It didn't go that way. But that's what took me into prison ministry. And I started the prison ministry work there in Kenai. My prayer partner and good friend Michael still carrying that forward. Or I could at least put myself in a place where I could tell people about Jesus. It was this that got me involved in the Pastors Association. Not here, but there in Homer. Not exactly non-believers, but that's where God led me to be with them. And that group of pastors, they asked me, as I became good friends with them, they asked me to preach at a Christian get-together that they called One Lord Sunday. And I was able to preach to 1,500 people at the local high school because I asked God to show me how to be intentional about reaching people. It was later that they asked me, I was asked by the Christian youth in that town there to come and tell my testimony as a celebration at their high school graduation. We had people come and worship at our church because of that sermon. I had people come up to me on the street in that small town because of that sermon. I have so many stories that I could tell. I'm going to skip a few because it's going to get too long. And many times when I was witnessing in prison or working with those pastors, I would think, Lord, am I doing any good? I'm not accomplishing anything here. And I would just get kind of a reassurance as I prayed that I was where I was supposed to be. We just need to be doing what we can to build friendships and hopefully with people that we can lead to Jesus or lead them to this unique and beautiful message that we have. But we have to get intentional about sharing Jesus through our lives and finding people that we can become friends with and show them what Jesus has done for us. For the longest time I wore that brace on my wrist, and I really didn't need it all that much for a long time, but I just kept wearing it because everywhere I go, people say, oh, what happened to your wrist? I had a story for them then, That's all He calls us to do. To show them what Jesus has done for us personally in our lives. And I know it's hard, and I get why churches after a while just want to settle in and settle down with the unwritten statement, let's just talk to ourselves because it's much easier, right? Because reaching people is hard. Jesus felt so impressed on this topic that one time He just hauled off and told 3 stories back to back to back in rapid session. We've talked about this before. All of them with the same exact punchline. Lost people really matter to God. You remember the stories well. The shepherd with 100 sheep, but one of them wandered away, and he put those 99 sheep at peril. They're not in a safe pen. They're out there in the open field, and he leaves those sheep because that sheep really matters to the shepherd. And when he finds that sheep, they have this great celebration, right? For the sheep that is found. And then the woman with the 10 coins, we know the story. She loses a coin, and she searches and searches and searches. And when she finally finds that coin that she's searching for, she has this big celebration because the lost is found. The lost mattered to her. And then there's the father who had 2 sons. One wandered off, wild living in the city. But when the son comes home, the father is just ecstatic with joy, isn't he? And he invites the village to a party, barbecues the fatted calf. Because the son was there, the lost son was found, and there's this huge celebration because you better believe that that kid mattered to the father. And so to take a page out of Jesus' preaching notebook, I'll follow a similar format this morning with the time that we have left. And I'll give you a couple stories back to back illustrating the same point. Same punchline. Lost people really matter to God. Carl met Lisa at the first class that he took at an MBA program there at a local university. It was a class in public speaking, and the first thing that they did is ask them in the class there to turn to the person next to them and introduce yourself to them. So he turned to her and she said, "Hi, I'm Lisa." She gave him a card, had a bunch of initials on it. She worked at Boeing, and she said, "I just want to get my MBA as well, and I've been dreading this class because I hate public speaking. What do you do?" He said, "Well, I'm a pastor." And she said, "Really? So you like public speaking?" And he said, "Well, yeah, I don't mind it. And if you need any help with it, I'll be glad to help you." She said, "Well, yeah, I'll probably need it." Well, it turned out she didn't need it at all. And she just aced all of the speeches. The professor loved her, hated Carl. He was lucky to get a C on any of his speeches, and he was happy for Lisa, but he just couldn't figure the whole thing out. Well, one day after class, Lisa stopped him as they were headed out, walking out to their cars in the parking lot, and she said, "You're a pastor, right?" And he said, "Yeah." "So that means that you believe in God. He said, yeah, I do. Well, would you mind telling me about this God that you worship? And Carl, he could hear that his heart was just pounding faster. I mean, because this was the moment, where eternity is hanging in the balance, and he could give this gospel presentation. And so best that he could, he told her about Jesus and the friendship that he had with Jesus and about God's way of reconciling us to Him and so on. And when he finished, she said, well, that's interesting. Well, Lisa, if you ever want to come to church, we would just love for you to come to church. And she said, well, I'll think about it. We'll see. He had all but forgot about the conversation. It was months later. He was sitting in church looking out over the congregation. And who should he see but Lisa and her boyfriend, Jerry? And he couldn't wait to talk to her in the lobby after the service, came up, gave her a big hug. Lisa, it's so good to see you. Jerry, we're so glad that you're here. Well, yeah. We came last Sunday morning. You didn't tell us that your services were on Saturday, she said. And he said, well, I'm not really a very detailed person. And so she said, the reason we came, check it out. And she showed him a big rock on her finger. She said, Jerry proposed. We're getting married. She said, you're the only clergy-like person that I know. And I was really hoping that you could officiate at our wedding. But I'm actually disappointed because the service is going to be on Saturday morning and it's the only time you work. Well, he said, no, Lisa, I can get off work for that. I would love to do your wedding. I would be honored, thank you. And I'll absolutely do it. Oh, good. Hey, you got to come back to church next week, he says. You know it's on Saturdays now. You got to come back. Well, yeah, maybe. It wasn't as weird as I thought it was going to be, she said. Well, who knows? Maybe so. Well, the next Friday he comes to the church. He notices the grass hadn't been mowed that week and it looked really sloppy. Now, normally that wouldn't bother him at all, but he'd been hoping and he'd been praying that Lisa and Jerry would be coming to church that week. And the grounds, this just didn't look acceptable to him at all. What does that say how important the church is to those when it looks like this? And so he called the head deacon and he said, hey, we got to get the lawn mowed. He said, yeah, I'm sorry, Pastor, the riding lawnmower, it broke down. I'm going to fix it on Sunday. I'm on that on Sunday. And Carl says, no, that can't happen. We got to mow this grass today. And the deacon said, well, I'm sorry, but we don't have a riding lawnmower and it's a big lawn. And Carl says, I don't care, if we have to use scissors, I'll help you do it. You see, it's one thing to do evangelism, but sending out, when we send out those mass mailings and faceless people and we do all that, and that's good, where we hope that we can convince them that our doctrine is right and correct and they'll join our church and so on. That's good. But I'll tell you, it's a whole different thing of evangelism when it's an actual friend and a face and somebody that matters, and suddenly you start seeing church and grounds and everything. You start seeing it through their eyes. Well, they got some push mowers and they got it mowed, and sure enough, that Sabbath, Jerry and Lisa came to church, and they came the next week and they got involved in the church and they formed this really good friendship. And a couple of years later, they had an evangelistic series there at the church there, and Jerry and Lisa were coming. Well, toward the end of the series, he went over to visit Jerry and Lisa at their house. And by now they were really good friends. And he said, look, you guys, I was wondering, how would you like to get baptized? And they said at the same time, we thought you'd never ask. Yes, of course we want to be baptized. We love that church. And I'll tell you, friends, there's nothing better than standing in a baptistry with someone you've seen grow in Jesus, and then bringing them up out of that water to a new life in Jesus. It doesn't get any better than that. And it's been 15 years now, and Jerry and Lisa, they love that church. Story number 2. I think I've told this story before, but you know, a good story bears repeating, doesn't it? They'd canvassed over the summer, going door to door, selling books and Bibles. And at the end of the summer, they got together at the summer camp to just relax and play a little bit, water ski, have some fun. Well, the last night before they headed home, they stayed up late playing basketball together, and it was around midnight when they finished. And they said, hey, why don't we go swimming? And it was hot and muggy. They wanted to cool off, and they said, oh, yeah, that's a great idea. They went and got their swimming trunks, went down to the lake. They were splashing around, having a good time. And after a while, somebody asked, have you seen Dave? Well, yeah, Dave, I mean, he was right around here. I saw him swimming here with us. Well, he's not here now. He's disappeared. Nobody knew where he went, so they started scouring out through the cabins and looking around the campground. Nobody knew what happened to Dave. He just disappeared. And finally, somebody back at the shore suggested that they lock hands, which they did. And they started to walk out into the water together, and they would go down and come up for air, go back down, walk a little ways, come back up for air. Finally, somebody on the very end shouted, you know, I felt something. I think I felt something. And so they went diving down. And sure enough, it was Dave. They gave him mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and CPR. For half an hour, they worked begging, Lord, please, please, please save him. And finally, the paramedics came and they whooshed him away in the ambulance. And about 45 minutes later, they called back to the campground and announced that Dave was pronounced dead on arrival. Everybody was just numb. They just lay there in their cabins, echoing the question over and over again that just haunted them. What if? What if they had formed that human chain a little bit earlier? I mean, you talk about a heavy, heavy thought. Dave may have lived. He may still be alive. Who knows? And the stakes are even higher when we talk about an eternal life or eternal death. You know, if we're honest with ourselves, the world around us is drowning in sin, and we're living right at the end of time. We're nearing home. And so I appeal to you to focus on what really matters, because the truth is, we really are in a world drowning with sin, a world of people that are going to Christless graves. And you know, eternity really does hang in the balance. And so what we're talking about, I mean, this one here, it really, really matters. You know, as a pastor, I've spent a lot of time discussing things that matter. But they don't matter that much. I mean, I can remember bringing a church together and spending hours talking, discussing really passionate feelings, discussing about whether or not we should have a steeple, you know, building a new church, whether we should have a steeple. Somebody donated money for a steeple. Some wanted, some didn't. Back and forth. And you know, I do think that the decorum in a church building is important, but it's not this important. And you know, I've been part of conversations about worship styles and what we're going to do in church. And again, I think worship and all of that is really an important issue. And music in churches is an important thing. We need it. But it's not this important. You know, what we're talking about here today, this one really matters. It matters to people who face an eternity without Jesus. It matters to parents, to prodigal children, right? I mean, you ask any parent who's raised their kids in the church, and you ask them if it matters at all, if there's a church in their neighborhood that is really obsessed with doing whatever it takes to reach their kid. How to interest the uninterested, to reach that kid. And I mean, they're tossing and turning tonight. How can we reach your kid? What can we do? What kind of program can we implement? What can we do to talk her language, to talk his language? How can we get that kid back into the safety of the church or community of faith? I mean, you ask that parents, does it matter to you if there's a church like that? My guess is that parents will say, yeah, it really matters. It really matters, and it matters to God, who gave the very best that He had. He gave His beloved Son, who was hammered to a bloody cross, to reconcile a lost human race to a loving Father. You know, lots of things that we do in church, they matter, but they don't matter all that much. But this one right here, it really matters. Amen?